right. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Can you hear me okay? So thank you so much for joining today's webinar on setting quota for high growth teams. This webinar is hosted by Fullcast, and today's speaker is Matt Haller, the founder of the Startup Seller. I'm Catherine Holt, the community manager here at Fullcast, and Fullcast is a software for sales planning and CRM policy automation. We work with organizations seeking to maximize sales operations function and grow sales teams. A big part of our sales operations is compensation and quota design. So today we're joined by Matt Haller, who has a lot of experience with sales management. So Matt is the founder of the Startup Seller, a consulting firm specializing in go-to-market planning for early and mid-stage startups. Matt is a thought leader in sales communications and messaging, as well as designing sales teams to drive growth. And he also has a lot of experience with compensation and quota design. You may have joined our webinar on compensation fundamentals with Matt in January, which was fantastic. We had a great time. So we've invited him back to do another webinar with us. And this time, Matt will be talking us through his philosophy and best practices for setting and distributing quota. So this is a 45-minute webinar, and Matt will be talking for about 30 minutes, maybe a little bit more. But we've saved a lot of time for questions at the end. So you can ask questions at any time by typing in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And yeah, we'll cover all of those at the end, so feel free to ask as we go along. All right, well, now I will pass this over to Matt to get started and cover our agenda.
Awesome. Thank you, Catherine, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm really excited to be back with Fullcast and talking about the other side of compensation. Right? Earlier this year, like Catherine mentioned, we did a webinar on sales compensation design. We hope that a number of people on this call were also part of that. And today we'll talk about the flip side of that, talk about quota and what's the right way to be thinking about organizing your sales plan, distributing that number, and ensuring that reps know exactly what their targets need to be in order to achieve. Okay. We'll start by conversation just by defining what quotas are overall, why companies deploy them. We'll then break into the different components of the quota process. So there's quota setting and deployment. We'll talk about what those are. We'll talk about ways that we should be setting our quota, how we think about calculating that number. We'll talk about the deployment methodologies and different ways that we can distribute the number to our reps. And finally, we'll get into quota communications because we've all been in the position where we work really hard to make sure the quota number is right. We work with the sales manager, and then the rep comes back and says, my quota is wrong. And then all of a sudden the sales manager does a 180, and we have to go back to the drawing board with our quotas. So kicking off, we'll start with what are quotas? Why do companies deploy quota in the first place? And a quota is just the assigned productivity targets that we give to our reps that aim to equitably distribute the company's revenue goals to maximize productivity and earnings. And that equitable component is really important. And we know that some reps are going to do more than others based on the territory, so we expect to be giving them a different quota, but there's more than one way for us in order to deliver that number. There's 9 principles that we talk about with quota, and I know that it's a lot, but these are all equally important. The first principle is aligning with strategy. When we're deploying our quota and we think about calculating what those numbers need to be, we need to make sure that that number aligns to where we want our business to go. So for example, if we are projecting high growth in the healthcare vertical, we expect there to be a high growth in the quota for that vertical as well. The second big principle is around considering sales motions. The different accounts are going to buy differently. And we want to make sure that when we are deploying our quota, that it is, we're ensuring that number one, the quota is realistic. Right? So making sure that we're not dumping quota into the territory because we tapped out our major accounts. And then the second thing we want to do is make sure that the quota is accounting for different routes to market as well. So one thing that I see a lot with startups is we deploy just one number to our reps, but we don't account for the sales we're going to get from our channel, right? So as a result, you start seeing a world where your reps and partners start to fight with each other over deals because reps don't feel like there isn't another earning opportunity for them. The third principle is around uniform execution. So ensuring that the process for all like incumbents is the same. Because quota has such a big impact on compensation, we have to ensure that we have a rigorous process that's documented and treats everybody the same, because otherwise we can be put at a legal risk because we're differentiating earning opportunity. The fourth principle is keeping it simple. If your reps can't understand what the number is, how that number was calculated, how they got their number, then there can be communication challenges, and that can lead to a lengthening of your sales execution process and just make it harder to go to market. Number 5 is ensuring that they're equitable. So we want to set quotas that are achievable, albeit a little bit of a stretch goal, to ensure that there's confidence in the quota system, but want to make sure that quota aligns with that opportunity in the territory. So if there's a rep who's got a greenfield territory, they have to go and build all the infrastructure themselves. I don't expect the same productivity from a rep who's in a more mature territory with a lot of upsell opportunity, for example. Number 6 is comp model alignment. So we want to make sure that the quota that we're deploying aligns to the measures in our comp plan. So if we have an ARR measure, let's make sure our quota is measured in ARR, so that there's very clear alignment between what the rep's trying to do and the conversations they're having with the customer, as well as the way we're measuring them from a quota perspective. Number 7 is deploying the entire quota. Right? Some companies even over-assign. They add a little bit of buffer, but we want to make sure that we are giving our entire sales plan out to our sales reps so we can maximize the chances that we're going to hit our number. Number 8 is delivering on time. This is a kind of a no-brainer for everybody on the call who's been in sales operations, but we know that the longer it takes for quotas to get out, what do reps do at the beginning of the year? They go on vacation, and they're not actively building the pipeline because they don't know what their target needs to be. And then finally, number 9 is clearly inform recipients. So create that communication process where managers can explain to reps how the numbers were calculated, how they got to their number, and even consider involving some of your sales managers in the quota deployment process to make sure that there's buy-in from that management level. And again, reduce the overall risk that reps are going to reject their quotas. So next, we're going to talk about the 2 major components around quota. So on the one hand, we have quota setting, which we're defining as how we calculate that overall sales number. Right? That is, the business wants to do $100 million next year. What uplift do I need to apply in order to make sure that we actually can hit that $100 million in revenue? Okay. The second bucket is around quota deployment, which is then taking that number, that big quota number, and distributing it to segments, to managers, to reps in order to make sure everybody has their individual targets. Within quota setting, there's 2 buckets. The first one is the target setting, and that was, like I mentioned, that calculation to figure out what does my quota number need to be. Typically, this is a finance process, although you might involve sales ops as well. And it's usually a top-down analysis of previous company performance, growth expectations, and then we add sales attributes in order to ensure the business can deliver on revenue and profitability targets. Once that initial number is calculated, there is a handoff or an interlock between sales where we do a bottoms-up analysis to see, do we have the capacity in our sales organization in order to achieve that number? And where do we expect that we're going to be able to make bets in order to hit our number? Okay. On the other hand, within quota deployment, there's 2 other buckets that we talk about as well. The first one is the actual quota deployment process, right? There's different methodologies that we can use in order to deliver the quota to the rep, and we'll get into those in a little bit. And then there's also the quota delivery. So communicating the compensation plan and communicating the quota in a way that motivates and incentivizes the reps to want to overachieve, but also highlight a path to success. The reason why we separate all these different components of the quota deployment process is because, number 1, it simplifies things. If somebody comes back and says, I have a question about this number or that number, it's easier to go and break down the different components and react in the appropriate area, as opposed to have to go back to the drawing board and wonder where something may have gone wrong. So I want to double kick into quota setting right now and talk about how companies can get to those top line numbers. What I like to tell my clients when I'm doing work on quota is, number 1, we want to start with historical revenue to calculate that quota number. Right? What did we do last year? Where are we trying to go next year? From there, we add a growth expectation. Business is going to grow. We want it to grow, so we have to add that growth. And then we add another component of contra revenue. So these are the costs that are associated with sales. Your partner revenue, marketing funds can go in there. we want to make sure the sales team can pay for itself. So let's make sure we're uplifting a little bit of a buffer so that we know that we're paying for the budgets that we're dishing out in marketing or partner funds. And then finally, we add a buffer. And that buffer can either be between levels of sales management. It can be at the overarching number, and add a little bit of that buffer because we know not all of our reps are going to hit a quota. So using that buffer ensures that we're able to achieve even if all of our reps don't achieve. Once that number is calculated, like I mentioned, we do the bottom-up analysis. And there's three major methodologies that companies will use for that. The first one is a cost-based methodology. So what happens in this methodology is we calculate the cost per rep and the expected profitability, right? The profitability we want out of that rep. And then we back into a quota figure based on that overall and average sales cost, right? So you might say that I've got a rep who's, I'm paying them $100,000 a year. I add 20% on top of that for bonus, and I want to make sure that I can get a 90% profitability out of that person. Well, then my quota can be $1.2 million. The next big methodology that we use for capacity planning is sales velocity. And this is, I think, one that I've seen a lot of startups with fast and short sales cycles use. What they'll do is say, what's the number of deals that a rep needs to sell in a month, a quarter? What's the deal size need to be? And by multiplying those two figures, we're able to determine what that optimal quota is and ensure that we have the capacity to hit that number. And then number three is we have the rep-based methodology. So we go rep by rep, we look at the opportunities and we see, do we think this rep can hit this number, and ensure that we have the heads that we need to achieve the overall sales target. One thing I want to caveat with the capacity planning is that in some cases you might look at this and go, well, those look awfully like quota deployment methodologies. But we want to separate the capacity planning from quota deployment because we want to validate the headcount, validate the sales plan before we go into figuring out what every rep's individual quota needs to be. Because it's a more detailed conversation to look at the attributes of a territory, the attributes of the rep, than just simply saying, you know, putting my finger in the air, do we have the capacity to hit our number? So at this point, we know what our number needs to be. We know that we have the number of sales heads. We know we have the plan that we can achieve with. Now we go through and we deploy the quota. And we're going to call out 5 different methodologies that companies can use. And one thing that I try to tell my clients when we're talking about a quota, and this is especially true for more mature and larger organizations, is it's okay to move away from a single quota methodology and separating the deployment methodology by segment. And the reality is accounts are different. The data that you have on accounts and territories is going to be different. And as we start getting larger, we have to start dialing in the quotas a little bit more. We want to make sure that we're using the right process, we're using the right data to make sure we're making the optimal decision. And on the next couple of slides, we'll go through detailed examples of each one of these methodologies. The first one we'll talk about is around account planning. And this one's very simple. And all we do is we get a cross-functional group together. We'll get finance, we'll get sales ops, we don't even get marketing in the room to look at account by account. What has that account done in the past? Break that down by product, look at what the opportunity is in every account, what the pipeline is, and you'll triangulate a quota number. And this is more about negotiation than anything else. This methodology is really good when you have larger complex accounts, there's multiple buying centers. It's a scenario where it's really hard to understand what the actual opportunity is in the account just by looking at the data. And so by bringing teams together, especially if they're a global team, bringing them together to really assess what's happening buying center by buying center can be really helpful. In addition to leveraging that insight that might not exist in the systems, it also promotes trust because you're bringing your reps to the table, you're bringing sales managers to the table to have a detailed conversation about their accounts. And that means that you already are kind of ahead of the game from a communications perspective. The downside is that this methodology cannot scale. It's really good when you have maybe 5 or 10 strategic accounts and you do this, you do your annual sales interlock. It takes about a week. But this methodology is not something that you want to use if you have 50 reps, right? it'll take too much time. It's not going to give you the returns you want. The next methodology we'll talk about is the, call it growth plus. So all we do is we tack on the company growth projection to the previous year's quota in order to quickly deploy the individual quota. So I had a number from last year. I had a quota plan last year. This year we want to grow 10%. So everybody's quota is going to get a 10% uplift, right? This methodology works really well when there's a lot of accounts or the sales cycles are really short. It also might work if you're a younger organization and the conversation is less about making sure we get the right number. It's just getting a number out, as well as giving sales ops or finance the kind of space that they need in order to focus on more strategic projects that are going to enable the business to grow more sustainably in the long term. The methodology is great because it's simple, it's easy to explain to reps, and you can deploy the quota quickly. Right? The rep, it's very easy to have a conversation with the rep and say, hey, your quota was $50,000 last year. The company needs to grow at 10%, so your new quota is $55,000. Reps can understand that. The downside to this is it doesn't account for the individual factors other than the rep or the territory. So, for example, one rep might have totally blown out their quota last year, and they really don't have any earning opportunity in the territory anymore. Adding on a growth figure can lead to a boom and bust cycle where one year they do really well, the next year they don't do so well, and we try to stay away from that because it can lead to rep churn. As a kind of negotiation or a middle ground, there's also the modified growth plus methodology, which differs from the growth plus methodology in the sense that instead of providing the same growth across all of my reps, I want to apply an equitable share of that growth across each of the territories based on programmatic principles. We try to keep that programmatic. So as an example, and we'll try to walk through this, and I know it can be a little bit complicated. The starting point is looking at what percentage of last year's sales did each rep complete. And that gives me my starting point for the quota. So in this example, on rep number one, they did 33% of last year's sales. I know I need to grow 10%. So their new share of the quota is going to be 36%. Okay. And we'll notice now that number adds up to over 100% now. From there, we apply modifying factors based on the account. And these can be, like I said, we try to keep them programmatic, but it can be anything like they had a windfall deal, they had a really large territory, the territory was mature, rep tenure. All of these factors aim to dial in the quotas a little bit more of a detailed way, and assign a new quota percentage. And then based on that new percentage, we aggregate, we assess that percentage against the new quota, and that's how the rep gets what their new quota is. The good news about this is it's relatively simple. Once you wrap your head around it, it's easier to understand. But it also allows for field input in a programmatic way. So that means that reps or managers can feel as though they're part of the process. And again, allows us to dial those quotas in a little bit more of a detailed way because we're allowing for that modifying factor. The downside of this methodology is that algorithm can be difficult to determine as it's unclear which territory characteristics will equitably distribute that growth, right? So in some accounts, territory size is really important. If you have field reps, they have to physically drive. In other situations, if you're doing inside sales, the territory size doesn't matter as much. But everybody on the call here is the owner of their business. They know what data points are good for them. And I would expect that working with sales, you'll be able to come up with a good methodology and a good weighting system that works for this methodology. Our fourth methodology we'll talk about is the analytical methodology, which is simply using a computer model to assign opportunity by account for every territory. You're starting to see this happen a little bit more, especially with really large customers. HP, Cisco are starting to move into this direction where they want to use more territory analytics in order to predict the opportunity within an account. This methodology is great when when you want to get quotas out really quickly, and it's good when you have a really strong data about each one of your territories. But obviously, the model is only so good if the data inputs and quality are good as well. So more often than not, this methodology ends up being more directional, or sometimes it can be used to stress test another methodology against the quota deployment. Other cases, you might use this in, for example, your territory accounts, where you might have 100 reps, and you don't want to go through the whole process with them using another methodology. So we just run it through a model, and we distribute the opportunity, and we call it a day. And then finally, our last methodology we'll talk about is the role-based methodology, which is really the simplest way to deploy a quota. What we do here is we say each role, regardless of your territory, your customer, your segment, each role has a productivity expectation. And we just say, if you're in this role, this is what your quota is going to be, full stop. So for example, if you're an enterprise AE, maybe your quota is $5 million. Territory AE might be $1.2 million. The good news about this is that it's simple and it's equitable because everybody has the same number. The downside is, again, it doesn't account for those individual characteristics within the market or individual performance that ultimately can impact how well a rep can hit their number. So now we've talked about 5 different ways to deploy a quota. We've talked about setting the quota. At this point, we've got our file ready to go, ready to deliver to our reps. And at this stage of the game, what I've seen a lot from my clients is we run out of gas at the end. The sales planning process takes a couple of months. It's a number of interlocks. Of course, Excel crashes a couple of times. So we're really kind of at our wit's end when it comes to deploying quota, but the finish line isn't done yet. The finish line isn't done until reps get their quotas and sign their sales letters. And it's absolutely critical that we keep our eye on the ball and we keep moving forward throughout this critical phase of deployment, because I have seen entire sales planning processes fall apart once the quotas get deployed to reps, right? Rep mutiny, rep rejection can be a real issue if there's a lot of people who reject their number. So to mitigate that, the first thing we want to do is explain that quota setting methodology. So remember back earlier in the conversation, we talked about how we calculate that overall sales plan number. Share that methodology with the reps, make sure it's easy to understand, and it's something that they can look at and go, okay, yep, if I were setting a quota, I would do it that way as well, because we want them to buy into the overall number. And by the way, in many cases, it's not even a conversation with sales or sales ops to figure out what that number is. Right? Oftentimes finance says we have to hit that number next year, or our investors say we have to hit this number next year. So by telling our reps these stories, these anecdotes, it helps them buy into the mission and say, look, there's nothing I can do. This is just the reality of the number that we have to hit. The second thing we want to do is share that deployment methodology. And if your sales managers are involved in the quota deployment process, share the data. Right? Have the sales managers have a conversation with their reps about why the quota was set a certain way, so that they can understand the connection between the overall sales plan and their number. The conversation might look like, okay, sales rep, our business has to do $50 million next year, and we know that 50% of our business comes from our named accounts. So we know that the overall named accounts business is going to do $25 million this year, or needs to do $25 million. And here's how we broke that $25 million to get to your $5 million, or whatever the number is. Okay. If reps understand both the quota setting process and the quota deployment process, and it's logical, and there's not a lot of wiggle room, there's not a lot of room for argument or discussion. Okay. And then finally, and this is perhaps the most important part of the process, help the reps plan to overachieve their quota. Right? In the rep's mind, they had just finished a long quarter, a long fiscal year, and they were really grinding it out to hit their number. Every rep knows that the number is going to go up, but there's always that sticker shock when they actually see that number. And so what we want to do is show them that although they feel as though they're going to have to do more work than last year in order to hit that same number, help them make a plan to overachieve. Look at their pipeline. help them think about what new opportunities that they can uncover. What could they be doing differently in order to increase their deal size and ultimately achieve their quota? By helping them put that plan together, not only can you make the rep feel more confident, you're putting the onus on the sales managers to really own those conversations with their reps. And ultimately, you're helping your reps reduce any anxiety they have about going into the new fiscal year. On a final note, I wanted to touch around this area around quota philosophy. Basically, quota philosophy is the way in which the companies will set that overall number and distribute it in order to try to force fit that bell curve distribution of rep performance. There's lots of different ways to do it. In a perfect world, we would set 100% of the quotas so that 100% of our reps hit 100% of their target. That's the perfect world. Unfortunately, the reality is that due to many different variables and data points outside of our control, that's an unrealistic expectation. So what we've seen is that striving for a 50 to 60% rep participation rate, right, trying to get 50% of our reps to at least achieve quota, is the optimal number that we aim for within the quota deployment process. What this does is it, number one, promotes a culture of healthy competition, promotes trust in management because you can see that people actually were able to achieve, and it promotes confidence in the overall quota process. If we shift the bell curve here to the right and we have more reps achieving quota, not only does your cost of sales go up, but your reps also get this kind of entitlement air about them where they feel like as though they're entitled to these earnings and overachieving the compensation plan. And we know that at some point that's going to be untenable from a financial perspective. On the flip side, if we move the bell curve to the left, as more reps fail to meet their quota, right, our cost of sales still increases because we are paying more in the variable cost versus actually being able to achieve our number. But the other issue is that reps mistrust the process, they mistrust the number, and it can lead to churn as well. Right? So take a look at your own quota distribution. We should be doing this on an annual basis in order to figure out how we're setting our quota today, what that philosophy is, and how we ultimately can try to get that 50 to 60% participation rate that, again, promotes that trust in the process and management. So with that, I think I can pass the ball back to Catherine. I know we had a lot of content in a very short period of time, so I think we can open up for some questions.
Awesome. Yeah, we've got a few come in, Matt. So the first question I have is, do you recommend experimenting with different methods of quota setting or choosing one and sticking to it?
So I think in the early stages of your company, pick one methodology, keep it simple. So I think the ones that work really well are like rep-based or growth plus, maybe modified growth plus. But as your company grows, you'll reach this inflection point where you'll start noticing different performance levels among teams or verticals. And that's when you need to start changing that methodology. When we start defining a segmentation pyramid, we have named accounts, we probably want to treat them a little bit differently than we treat the rest of the market. Right? We have more data on them, we're asking more of them, so we would use a different methodology to make sure we're getting that number right.
Okay, great. So I do have a question here about, can you share the slides after the presentation is over? So everyone will get a recording of the session, but Matt, do you want me to send the PDF of the slides as well?
Yeah, we can share the PDF, and I can send you a new one, Catherine.
Okay, great, awesome. All right, the third question I have is, do you have a favorite method out of these 5?
Ooh, so I don't have a favorite method. I think that it's more about matching the method to the segment. I will say, if I were in a sales ops manager's shoes, thinking about how I can make an impact on the quota deployment process, I think the simplest thing that you could do is try to implement that modified growth plus methodology. Right? What's great about it is it adds the data and the analytics that we're all so comfortable with working in sales ops with a with that rep and field input, that allows them to feel as though they're part of the process. And that can really reduce a lot of friction when setting quota.
Okay, awesome. Next question is, how do you determine the modified factor percentage?
In terms of as I'm assuming that's in terms of the weighting of each of the factors. And typically, yeah, so typically when we've done this methodology with clients, it's still more of an art. It's trying to add some science to the art. So when figuring out what that algorithm is, oftentimes it starts with a conversation between sales finance and sales ops about what the metrics are that we measure our business. And I think everybody probably has those KPIs. From there, we're gonna go through the methodology and the model, and it's an iterative process to figure out what the right number is. At the end of the day, you might look at you might set the algorithm a certain way, and then the number will come back for a rep and you say, well, that rep certainly had a big deal last year, but their quota doesn't need to come down by that much. And so there's always going to be those little iterations and tweaks that need to take place within the quota process.
Okay, great. Another question is there a method that you find works best for startups?
So at the early stages, I think keeping it simple is the best, right? So at the outset of your first 5 reps, I think the rep-based methodology works really well, right? Because you haven't carved out a territory, you haven't carved out segments yet. So taking a rep and just saying, look, your quota is $1.5 million, go out and get it. I don't care how you do it, go find it. And then as you start to grow a little bit, I think, and you start to say, my sales team's a little bit bigger, I now have a more rigid tops-down planning process. Doing that growth plus methodology, the modified growth plus, might be a good way to move your planning process.
Okay, awesome. Well, those are all the questions in my queue. I'll give it just a few more minutes in case anyone has any more that they wanted to put either in the Q&A box or the chat. I've had some questions come in over both. Anything else that you would like to say or recommend, Matt?
I think the one big shift that we're seeing with quota, and I really cannot stress this enough, is involving the sales team. I know that especially at the end of the quarter, they're busy closing deals, but it's really important that we get their buy-in, because at the end of the day, it's their number to own. And too often as sales operations professionals, we feel as though we need to take that number on, and it's our project because we're the ones who are driving most of it. But we need to remember that our client is sales, and we need to make sure that at some point they have to take ownership. And the earlier we can involve them in that process, the easier it will ultimately be to communicate them to reps, and then have us get on to the other strategic projects that are on our plates that are going to help keep that business moving forward.
Awesome, that's a really great point. All right, I've got one more question. Rather than locking territories and modifying quotas to fit the territory, might you standardize the role quotas and modify territories to right-size opportunity?
Can you repeat that question one more time?
Yeah, sure. So rather than locking territories and modifying quotas to fit the territory, could you standardize the role or the quota and modify territories to the right size opportunity?
So you could do that, but you're always going to need to figure out how many heads you need first. Before, that's part of that capacity planning model, which then usually informs the number of territories that need to be carved. I think that methodology can work as you are adding heads and just you're incrementally adding people to your business. But at some point, there'll be an inflection point where you need to go back and say, how am I going to readjust my territories to make them more balanced? Right? The longer your business goes on, the more you're going to learn about your customers and your territories. So at some point, you'll realize that what you thought was a standard territory actually has more accounts and might be an unequal earning opportunity for a certain rep, which then you'll naturally have to adjust those territories.
Awesome, great. Well, any last minute questions? I'll just give it a few more seconds, but I just want to thank everyone for joining. We've had really great attendance on this webinar, and we're really excited to have Matt again. And you'll be able to find a recording of this. Well, it'll be emailed to you, but we're also going to be putting this on our website. And then we also have Matt's compensation fundamental webinar on our website as well. So if you'd like more resources on that, feel free to check out fullcast.com. And if you look under resources, it'll be under videos. So thanks again to everyone for joining us. And if you have any questions about what Fullcast is doing, or if you'd like to get in touch with Matt, just shoot me an email. You should have that since I've been sending all the marketing emails to you guys. And thanks again for joining us, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. And thank you, Matt. You did a fantastic job and really great knowledge for all of us.
Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
Great. Bye.